Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're hailing from. Welcome to another episode of DevSecOps is the Way. Today, we're going to be talking about identity and access management, which is everybody's favorite thing, I'm sure, but a critical component in anyone's infrastructure. So Dave Muir's here with us today, and Dave is going to introduce our guest and show topic and all that fun stuff. So take it away, Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And I appreciate everyone joining today. So I'm just going to present a couple slides, and I promise these are the only slides you'll see in today's show. I think we have a really good one for you today. We've got Mark Borstein, who's the co-founder and CTO of Tremolo Security. We'll give Mark some time to introduce himself in a bit. I'm Dave Muir. I'm at Red Hat and the global solutions architect that's focused on our partners, on our security independent software vendor partners, mostly around OpenShift. So if you didn't know already, DevSecOps is the way, and it is a series, a monthly series that we're doing this year, starting in March. And we've broken down the different months according to a framework we've developed around DevSecOps. And you could see March was vulnerability, April was all about compliance, and month is identity and access month. And so what we do is we bring several publications to the general public. One is this OpenShift TV show. We also have another OpenShift TV show that we produce on a monthly basis. The other one we did this month was actually yesterday, so you can go catch it on YouTube if you missed it. We also produce about 3 podcasts and as much other content that we can assemble. We've done blogs and case studies and white papers and things like that. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we're actually going to be publishing a page on Red Hat that lists all this content by month. Nice. So you can quickly reference it. So we're excited about that. And so just to talk a little bit about the framework, and you could see what we've done here. We've actually worked with the industry and folks like our partners and other industry and analysts to come up with a taxonomy around DevOps and DevSecOps and what security categories you can name and plot against a DevOps pipeline. And you can see some of those categories here. We've got 9 different categories that map in certain ways across a DevOps pipeline. Underneath these categories, we actually have identified 34 different security methods or functions. So for example, under identity and access, you've got things like authorization and authentication. We'll talk about that, RBAC. We've also got things like secrets vaults under identity and access. And then we're able to sort of plot those against where we typically see integrations in DevOps. And that really helps, us have a conversation with our partners and with our customers about a comprehensive, layered approach to security when they're on their journey to DevOps. And some of the audience members may have seen some of these diagrams before where we have views of one or more partners plotted with Red Hat against all those 34 different security methods to really give you that comprehensive view. So that's the framework. A lot of content out there. Just Google DevSecOps framework, Red Hat, and you'll find actually a complete guide around this that you can get more details and more diagrams. So with that, I will stop sharing. And I'll just let Mark go ahead, and if you want to introduce yourself, you're the co-founder of Tremolo. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Thanks, Dave. So, hey, everybody out there in OpenShift TV land. My name is Mark Borstein. I'm the CTO of Tremolo Security. We founded Tremolo, I think actually we technically founded Tremolo in 2010. We didn't really kind of come out to the world until Red Hat Summit at 2015 in Boston. That was our first ever conference. And at the time when we were first founded, we were really pure play identity management. We started off I had spent, almost a decade total with PricewaterhouseCoopers as an identity management consultant, and as did my co-founder. And what we found was we were spending all our time working around a beautiful demo. Like, here's this beautiful demo for an identity system. And, the executives would all sit there and clap and say, this is perfect. This is going to fix all our problems. And then they drop it in the laps of the folks in the field that have to actually implement it. And we found we were spending all of our time working around the assumptions of what the vendor put together. Said, well, no, this isn't how this business actually works. Said, okay, there's got to be a better way. And so when we first founded the company and first had the idea, the buzzword at the time was virtual appliance. Like, there were no containers yet. And we were like, we're going to have this virtual appliance that, you could just drop in. And, nobody really needed to know what a virtual appliance was because it was marketing and, but it made people feel that that's what we had. And so we said, okay, we're going to take this toolkit approach. Instead of having this one monolithic thing that is your identity management system, we're going to give you something that's going to sound a lot like microservices for identity. We're going to give you your virtual directory, your user provisioning, your SSO, all these little components. And we're going to let you assemble them in a way that matches what you're doing. So implementation time, was turned on its head. We used to have a rule that for every dollar of software you buy, you're going to spend $2 implementing that software with professional services. We flipped it on its head and then some. Every dollar you spent on our software, you were spending like 50 cents on implementation time. And it made for a great implementation, made for a really hard demo because, we can do all the things that you want. And I mentioned Red Hat Summit in 2015 because that's when I was kind of first introduced to OpenShift, and I always had a soft spot in my heart for infrastructure. I always loved infrastructure, and I started learning about OpenShift, and this was pre-Kubernetes. This was OpenShift v2. And, we started to work with it and okay, this is interesting. And we're already pretty small and lightweight. So, we started looking into getting ourselves into a gear. And then we discovered Kubernetes and OpenShift v3. And we've been in love with Kubernetes and OpenShift ever since. We started our Kubernetes in the OpenShift world with OpenShift v3. And kind of understanding the differences between OpenShift and upstream Kubernetes and working with customers there. And then, the last 3 or 4 years really has had a focus on making it easier to secure your Kubernetes infrastructure. We were at the first KubeCon in Seattle back in 2016. We actually had a booth, and we were sitting there doing namespace as a service before anybody was really even talking about that. There wasn't even a concept of that yet. And we're seeing that more and more. And so what we've found is that, especially in the last 2 years or so, there have just been this explosion of systems where identity becomes super important because Kubernetes is designed not to do everything, right? It's a platform for building platforms. So if you're going to have a platform for building platforms, you need to have that platform know how to talk to all these different systems, and all these different systems have to know how to talk to each other. And that becomes a big identity game. So what went from initially just user provisioning has now morphed into user provisioning, access provisioning, and infrastructure provisioning, because once you know how to provision to one API, you can kind of provision to all of them. And so kind of taking it from that perspective has really accelerated the way that our customers are able to move forward. And, I've been doing open source since I was 18. And so it just made sense to me. So we, open source as well. We don't do open core. Everything's open source. If we make it, it's open source. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So, man, version 3 OpenShift. I don't even know what that means.
So I actually used version 3 to do a phishing campaign at one of my previous employers.
Wow.
We
Nice.
were a quasi Red Hat customer, right? Like we bought Rail and, had some support for that. And I was like, well, let's use this redhat.com subdomain here and run my phishing campaign and see how well it goes. It went splendidly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just works, right? Like, it was amazing.
Well, hey, Mark, I got to ask, I'm not a musician. My kids, I think, got the musical genes. It passed my generation. But what is tremolo? I think it's a musical reference, right?
Yeah. So, and I'll be the first to say I am an absolute poser when it comes to anything music. I can't get past Guitar Hero on easy. So, I tried to teach myself the guitar once and failed miserably. I was the kid in recorder in third grade who had to sit there and just play with my fingers because I couldn't get
Same.
it.
Yeah.
So what a tremolo is it's the fluctuation of the sound wave. So when you hit the whammy bar on a guitar, or you hit the fluctuate, I forget the name of the thing, on like an organ or something, you get that wave. That's called a tremolo.
Yeah.
And so what happened was I'm terrible at marketing. I'll be the first one. Like naming things, like no, not my forte. So one of my co-founders, who actually is quite good at marketing, we're trying to sit there, what's the name for this? Like we had thought up this idea, and the very first iteration of the product was and this will sound really close to the heart to all of us in the cloud native community, a universal reverse proxy that'll do authentication, authorization, integration. And the original idea was it was going to do any kind of authentication you wanted on the front side, and the back side was going to use Kerberos and S for you to sell for any Kerberos geeks out there. Never worked, but that was the original idea. Was to replace what's commonly known in the industry as a web access management solution. So if you're familiar with SiteMinder or Obelix, which is now Oracle Access Manager, kind of really old school tools like that, Sun Access Manager, those are web access management tools. They have agents, they're painful, they're expensive. So we wanted to build this reverse proxy where everything was just built in. And so my original idea for the company name was Auto IDM. And my co-founder was like, well, yeah, it describes it, but it's kind of clunky, doesn't really roll off the tongue, isn't super memorable. And so it's like, well, he came back to me and said, okay, Tremolo Security. He explains to me what a tremolo is. He goes, whammy bar, tremolo. I'm like, oh, that's stupid. Nobody's going to understand what that means. I'm like, no, come back with something else. So that night I spent 2.5 hours trying to find a domain name that had the word identity in it. I tried different languages. I tried everything. Couldn't find anything. Who is tremolosecurity.com? Nobody. Cool. That's the name of the company then.
Yeah.
And so since then, we've had the musical theme. So all of our different products, projects, sub-projects, all have kind of a musical take on it. But like I said, I'm a complete poser. Like I can't, I can't figure out the recorder, let alone a guitar.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I also know the discouragement when you've got a great idea and you have a domain name and then you go and see if it's open and it's not, and you're like, wait a minute, it doesn't even work, but somebody has it and you have to pay them $3,000. It's like, are you kidding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, cool. And you mentioned you did a lot of stuff with Red Hat and OpenShift and a lot of community involvement. Can you talk a little bit more about what you've done in the community?
Oh yeah, I mean we've been pretty active inside both the Kates and the OpenShift community almost since day one. Shout out to Diane Muller, the OpenShift Commons. Mm-hmm. Getting us involved in that. Whether it's just answering questions on Slack, doing briefings, stuff like that. And then, in the Kubernetes world, where we really got our start was when I think it was 1.3 when OIDC first debuted. I had to learn how OpenID Connect actually worked. I'd been doing a lot of SAML at that point, and I went back and in order to figure out how to integrate Unison, at the time it was Unison, it wasn't even open source yet, it was still a Unison, with Kate's using OpenID Connect, had to figure out how OpenID Connect worked, and the documentation was not awesome. And so I ended up writing a big wiki page for our website on how it all kind of connected and worked and all the different pieces. And folks were sending people to that wiki instead of the actual Kubernetes documentation, because it just got into much deeper detail. And so I was like, okay, well, that's an easy contribution, right? Let's go ahead and document. Documentation's hard. Like anybody who tells you that, or hand off documentation to a junior person or somebody to who downplays anything to do with documentation, has no idea what they're talking about. Like, I don't like to gatekeep. I'm sorry. You talk down documentation, no, like documentation is so important. And so that was really cool to me to be able to say, hey, let's write some documentation, because people actually get a lot out of that. So that was our first contribution. And since then, I've actually made some code contributions, which was fun. Added impersonation to the web UI, so that would work real well in hosted solutions. Recently added impersonation and reverse proxy OpenID Connect support to Kiali, so that's the dashboard for Istio. So that was a lot of fun. That was really interesting. And if you're in Slack and you ask anything about authentication or RBAC, chances are I'll be, the first or second person to respond to you. So we've been pretty active in the community. And then in the Red Hat world, we've been working with OpenShift. We were in the first class of the original certification process when it switched over to the newer certification process. We're in the first class when operators were, going to be the first thing. We're sitting there. What was it? When was the last time Summit was in Boston? 2019.
19, yeah.
I was sitting there during OpenShift Commons, fixing our scripts, because we do everything the hard way. So our operator is actually not built on the operator SDK. We wrote it in JavaScript. And so we were finding all these different edge cases with the certification script. We're working with them, figuring out what's going on. So we've always had fun, and Red Hat's just always been amazing to us. So we always have a blast working with y'all.
Yeah, likewise. And then you were just presenting at KubeCon last week, right? Or was it 2 weeks ago in Europe?
Week before, yeah.
Yeah.
It all blurs
We didn't
together.
get to go to Europe. So did a session on kind of I can RBAC and so can you. RBAC and authorization. It's one of those things that baffles people. Like people find it really, really hard to do, because it is in fact really, really hard to do. What a lot of I'm seeing now is, as Kate's is moving more and more into the enterprise, is a need to look at more deeply the authorization systems inside the cluster, especially as you start looking at your developer workflow, because your developer workflow isn't just Kate's, right? It's Kate's. It's a pipeline. Now, maybe that pipeline, we're going to talk about Tecton. So that runs inside your cluster. So that'll piggyback off of RBAC, but you might be using Jenkins. You might be using Circle CI or Azure DevOps or any of the 25 million other pipeline systems out there, right? They all have their own identity systems. They all have to securely talk to your clusters and your infrastructure. If you're using GitOps, whether it's Argo or Flux, we're going to talk about Argo today. That has its own built-in identity system. You look at your Git system, like, okay, we're going to make Git the center of our compliance world and our source of truth for what's happening. Now, GitHub and GitLab or whatever you're using, they all have their own identity systems. They have all their own processes, all their own setups. Where do you store your containers? Are you using the built-in registry in OpenShift? Are you using Harbor? Are you using one of the 25 other container registry systems out there? They all have their own identity systems. And so, where we started was kind of this namespace as a service, but what we're finding more and more is that all these different things need to talk to each other, and identity is a huge part of that. And so that's really where we've been spending most of our time lately.
Yeah. So it's a good segue. We'll get into the meat of it. Before we do that, I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about your book. It sounds like you're going to come out with a second version of it.
Yeah, we're looking to do a Rev 2, but that's going to take a little while. So I'll do a shameless self-promotion here. Kubernetes and Docker Enterprise Guide. The key to this book is that if you're working in enterprise, this book is going to speak to you. There's a little more Docker, I'll be honest, and I'm going to throw my publisher under the bus on this one. There's more Docker than I wanted, or either of us really wanted to be in there. Publisher told us we had to do more Docker, and my co-author bit the bullet on that one. He's a good man, better than me. The stuff that enterprises care about, because enterprises are just different, right? I mean, B2C, everybody is narrowly focused on that one thing. I'm getting you a ride, or I'm getting you a pizza, I'm getting you something else, right? And everything is so super focused on that. Whereas in enterprise, you have a handful of truly enterprise-wide apps, right? You've got collaboration, your email, your SharePoint, whatever you're using for collaboration. You've got HR systems, you've got ERP, you have CRM. Those are truly enterprise-wide systems. But then you have hundreds, maybe even thousands of applications that are very domain specific and can have anywhere between a few hundred users or a few thousand users, depending on the size of the organization. And to the people who use it, that is the most mission critical thing in the world. But to everybody else, they're worried about their thing. And so enterprises just have different things that they care about. They've got to worry about things like silos. They have to worry about things like the centralized authentication with the system that they don't own, right? If I'm working at a service provider, maybe they're using Okta or something like that, but it's more tightly integrated into the system. Whereas in an enterprise, the people who own Active Directory are not the same people who own your cloud native infrastructure, are not the same people who own applications, right? So the people who own Active Directory, man, Active Directory goes down, you're having a really bad day. Slack goes down, yay, we're going to go throw a party. Active Directory goes down, the dinosaurs start eating the tourists. The read-only account, that's easy. Write account, that's a little bit harder. So you have to deal with those silos. And then some of the less sexy things about Kubernetes, but things we all need to know, like backups, policy management, things like that. And then it all kind of culminates into the demo that we're going to do today. I had wished it was going to be live and it could break and I can show it breaking. Unfortunately, I managed to nuke my entire environment ahead of time, so we're going to have to go through a video demo. Yeah, it all kind of culminates into this, building a platform, right? How do you map your business logic into an actual implementation around GitOps and whatnot? So you'll at least be able to see the output of that last chapter.
Cool. Yeah. So let's dive into, challenges of identity during the workflow. I guess, do we want to step back and define what identity means?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of folks talk identity and think SSO. That's the first thing that pops into people's brains is SSO. And as painful as SSO is, that's the easiest part. That's simple compared to the rest of the identity landscape, because it's very transactional. It's one of those things that you're authenticated or you're not, and whether you're in legal or you're in DevOps or you're an executive, you're authenticated or you're not. There's not a lot of there from a business standpoint. authorization is where things get really dicey, because that's where you have to start to map your business processes into code, into infrastructure. And so that's a really hard thing to do. That really requires understanding not just the technology involved, because you have to be good technologists, because we're going to throw up the whiteboard here in a minute, and there's all these intricacies that you have to understand to do from a technology standpoint, but you also have to be able to go back and say, okay, what are the processes I need to implement this for? Like, why do I have to do it this way? So like going back to the book, in that last chapter, we don't even start talking about tech until we're about 2/3 of the way through. And we're talking about what's a pipeline, why do you design a pipeline a certain way, how do you design your developer workflow? Because that graphic that you showed at the beginning of all the different categories of security and whatnot, if you don't have a way to map that onto your business process, you can't match your compliance requirements because you don't know what they are. You can't make your users happy because you can't tell your users how to work. Your users are your customers, right? They have to tell you how they want to work. All the way up to and including even from an organizational standpoint, when we start talking about owning of identity, right? Who owns it? If I'm a cloud team and I own an OpenShift deployment, do I really want to be responsible for adding users into projects? I might, if that's what the business lines up with. It's been my experience that I don't. Usually what ends up happening is the cloud team says, we got enough to worry about just keeping everything up and running. Here's your sandbox, here's your field. Y'all are responsible for this. Just leave us out of it. We're going to make it so that it's as hard for you as possible to break things. So that becomes a really important process of who's going to own what, who's going to own that responsibility, and ultimately who's going to sign on the dotted line so that as it goes up the chain, and the CFO has to sign on the dotted line or they go to jail. Does everything map? Are the auditors going to be happy? Are we going to keep our CEO out of the Wall Street Journal for a breach versus,
right,
great numbers, because that they want to be in the journal for. So it really becomes important to be able to piece those things together.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's take a look at that developer workflow. One of the things I actually failed to mention when I showed that diagram is out of all the categories that we came up with, identity is the only category that's integrated at every spot. Mm-hmm. Like you can't get away from not addressing identity.
Oh,
at every point in the pipeline. It's the only category, so it's obviously very important. And so it looks like you've got your whiteboard up here.
Yeah. So I figured have some fun with a whiteboard instead of slides, because we all hate slides. Yeah. But let's think about a developer workflow, right? How do you want your developers to work? So you've got a prod environment, and you've got an application, right? So hello world, right? Because that's the most complicated application everybody builds. Yeah. Well, that runs inside of a container, right? And we'll say it's running inside of OpenShift. That container comes from a container registry. Now, this conversation here, you want to be authenticated, right? There's an identity. Chicken scratch writing. So how'd that container get into said registry, right? You've got a pipeline. See if I can draw a pipeline here.
Yeah, we're all judging your artistic capabilities.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I deserve to be judged. So you've got a pipeline, right? That pipeline is going to generate a container that needs to get pushed into that registry. That's another identity. Because obviously, if somebody gets a hold of that pipeline, and when I say gets a hold, it's not just, the hacker with the sunglasses and the hoodie, sitting there trying to ruin the world. It's the developer who forgot to switch their dev context. I personally have never done that, but it happens, right? I haven't done that since like this morning. So you've got your pipeline, but now that pipeline doesn't just push a registry. Let's talk about GitOps, right? Your pipeline is also going to push manifests into OpenShift, right?
Mhm.
So you've got your GitOps, you've got your Argo over here. I hope we have a prize for anyone who can actually read what I'm writing. So Argo needs to be able to talk to OpenShift, right? That's another identity.
Mm-hmm.
Argo needs to be able to talk to Git. That's another identity. And so far, we've only talked about things at a system level, right? I mean, we haven't actually like gotten into users, humans.
Yeah.
So we're still going, because your pipeline in the GitOps world isn't just going to generate a container, but it's also going to make an update to your manifests to point to that container. So that needs an identity here.
Sounds like we need a big notebook to write all these passwords down.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
Jesus.
no passwords.
That's a reference to yesterday's show with
I was about to say, yeah.
Mike Waite and his notebook. Wait, go ahead.
Anyways.
So we've got all that, but then Git needs to trigger a pipeline, right? You do a commit to Git, you want that to trigger a pipeline. So that's going to push to here, but you don't want just anybody who knows the URL to be able to trigger a pipeline. That's another identity. And then your Git repo. So you've got a pipeline that's got to be able to talk back and forth here. You've got a container registry. You've got your actual OpenShift, that's running the code. So all these different system level identities, okay? But now let's talk about the user identity for a second. So, I'm going to draw some swim lanes here. I'm going to bust out my my management consulting glove. And, you've got your devs, you've got your ops, and you've got your owners. So your owner, that's your pointy haired manager, right? And they're going to say, okay, we're deploying this new application. So I'm going to ask that somebody build the application infrastructure out. So that's actually another lane, but we'll just say that all gets automated, right? So new app. And I want my ops team to be able to get into the various namespaces associated with this app. But I don't want my devs to be able to. I want my devs to have to work locally and then commit into repos. So a new app gets created, and then as a dev or an op, I say, can I access? Now, that might be a ServiceNow ticket if you have to go through that process. Somebody has to ask it, or it's the email shuffle, right? Can I access it? That should really go to your owner, because that person is responsible for saying yes or no. Once you get a yes, you then need to get provision. But what do you actually get provision to? Well, if you're talking about GitLab, you should be a developer on the projects, but you shouldn't be able to commit to the projects, right? So you've got to go into GitLab as a dev, and then you're going to need to be able to access OpenShift. Like, even if you're just using it to access Tecton to be able to see what's going on. So some read access. And then you want to get into Argo. I mean, Argo is a great interface. You want to be able to see what's getting synced. It has its own identity system. So Argo. And then finally, your container registry. right? These all have their own identity system. There's no rhyme or reason. Like GitLab will have something similar to GitHub. It's, you know, it ain't the same language, but at least it's like, you know, somebody who's done GitLab will look at the way GitHub's permissions are set up and say, okay, that makes sense, and vice versa, but it's not the same thing. It's not the same API. It's not the same standard. So when you create your projects, you know, your application, you have to connect all these things from a user perspective so that as a user, all these things are seamlessly integrated. So, you know, we talk a lot about SSO and authentication getting in on the front side, but that's the easy part. Once you're in, what do you have access to? How are you restricted inside there to actually make your day easier, not harder? And we'll see that as part of the demo. So as a dev, I get provisioned into all these things. And then I'm going to go ahead and write some code. And then I want to push that into, you know, Git. And that's when we get to this stuff and all the magic happens, right? So all this stuff is happening behind the scenes. And when you want to provision this stuff, you know, think about it. In Git flow, you don't want to commit anything to that main project. You want to have forks. So you have a prod fork, you have a dev fork. You have some news from Fox, apparently. You know, and then I'm going to have a local fork, right? I'm going to have my own application fork that, you know, that I'm going to do my work. And then you want to do everything through pull requests and merge requests. Well, are you making sure to get your authorizations built to work with that? As you get new developers on board, how are you driving that access? You know, are you storing your groups in a database? Are you going to store your groups in Active Directory? Do you have the ability to do that? Are you going to store it in Okta? You know, where are you going to store that information? Who's going to own it? How do you keep it up to date? Do you have compliance issues? Like, you know, should somebody have to recertify this access every, you know, year, 60 days, 90 days, whatever it is? So like, I don't think it's published anymore, but a few years ago, Red Hat published this NIST 853 guide to OpenShift. So for those who aren't aware, NIST 853 is the Uber set of security controls that the government uses. That's like the baseline. And Red Hat published a guide and said, this is how you run these controls with OpenShift, and how, you know, a big giant spreadsheet. And there's, you know, 20 or 30 controls specific to identity management. And they all said, not my problem. That's somebody else's problem, right? Because it's a really hard problem to solve. You can't just say, this is how I do it. Even though OpenShift has its own, you know, OpenShift, unlike upstream Kubernetes, has its own built-in identity system, its own way of storing users and groups. There's still a lot of work that goes into making that happen from a control standpoint. So, you know, when you look at this and say, okay, well, I can get SSO into Argo. I can get SSO into OpenShift. I can get SSO into GitHub. That's the easy part. Building out all these relationships, that's the hard part. Like that, like comparatively speaking, not to say SSO is easy, but when you look at the iceberg picture, SSO is this little tiny part up here. The authorization framework is the bottom part down there. And that's really where the rubber hits the road. And what's great is it's big, it's daunting, but when you do it right, oh man, your developers love it. I've got one customer that they're a relatively small hedge fund as these things go in the UK. And we built out a system for them that, you know, user goes in and they say, I want to create a new project. And it was all AWS infrastructure. So it was, you know, we would build out their code build, their code commit, check in their initial stuff, you know, a template, you know, build out the namespaces, build out all the relationships between the identities. And they could go from that to production without interacting with anybody from ops. Like at one point it had gone about 6 months. I was like, hey, I haven't heard from you. How are things going? It was awesome. I don't talk to anybody. People leave me alone. It's great. I got enough shit to do. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, it's daunting, but once you get working, we'll see that here in the demo here in a second, it really and I don't know how to use gestures on Mac apparently. Can I get out of that? No. How do
you do what?
How do I? Hey, there we
Here's
go.
your
No, I don't want to leave. Stop share. There we go.
It'd just be Chris and myself picking our noses. Well, I would say, yeah, that it is a great thing for developers. Being a former developer, the most frustrating thing for me is that something that should know who I am doesn't. Like, I don't call this thing a smartphone because it takes me 5 tries for me to just unlock it sometimes. Like, so when everything works and I only have to, by the way, single sign in once and not 4 times a day to the same browser, and it's very it's nice, right? It's frustrating when that doesn't work.
Yeah, and like let's kind of show where the rubber hits the road here. All right, cool. So I'm sharing that. So this is the not so live demo, and we got a lot going on here. So what you're seeing, so in the upper left-hand corner, you got OpenShift, GitLab, Argo, and then the bottom left-hand corner is going to be OpenUnison. So OpenUnison is our open source project. That's what drives all of this. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm logging in as that app owner. I want to create a new application. So I'm going to go in and say, okay, create a new app for me. And because this was a live demo and I didn't want things to break, I pre-did as much as I could. So I'm going to say, okay, go ahead, please create a new namespace, create a new project for me. So the request goes in, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to log in as a ops person, somebody who's going to approve the creation of this project. Now this is kind of opinionated the way we thought people would want to do it, but going back to that business discussion, people are going to do it the way that they need to do it. So I've had customers who have started with this and said, you know what, we don't want an approval. We're going to use our own portal to do that process. We just want to call your API, right? And you want to be flexible enough to be able to handle all those different scenarios. So what I'm doing right now is I'm logging in as that ops admin. And you can see I've got that open approval. So I'm going to review it and I'm going to approve it. Now keep your eye on what's going on up here, because you're going to see just the scrolling of objects being created across multiple different systems. Takes a second or 2 or 10. So there we go. So it's starting to churn. You see all these provisioning engine implementation. That's objects that are being created across the infrastructure, inside of Argo, inside of GitLab. We're creating private keys in order to link everything. We're creating tokens, we're creating secrets. Everything's being created for you to be able to have that dev environment, that prod environment, that Tecton environment. And so all that stuff that we were talking about in that whiteboard session is now being created behind the scenes on your behalf, instead of having to engineer that out. Or script it out or Terraform it out. You know, you could use Terraform here or whatnot. But, you know, this is automating that entire process, and it's tied to identity. So not only is it automating that process, it's creating groups inside of a database that I have access to and I manage. So I can externalize my authentication while still managing the authorization, managing the business process around that. And it's also creating an audit of everything. So we're going to see here in a second, once I catch up, that I'm going to actually log in and take a look at the report. So I'm going to log out, log back in here because I'm realizing I didn't log out so quick. And so I'm going to go to a report here, and that report is just driven off of a database schema. Like we don't make you use some special fancy reporting tool. We include some simple reports just to make life easier, but it's all, you know, it's all open source, right? So you go to the audit report, and you can see that in this one, single user change log, this is the one the security folks really love, where we track every single object that gets created associated with this person. So it might be a permission that we grant the person, it might be an object tied to a workflow that that person executed. And then we're tracking all those different objects being created. And another report will show which workflow it's associated, who approved it, right? And it's all just SQL, so you can slice it and dice it whatever way is important to you. But now when it comes to how do you actually do your audit, you have something to audit against. We've got one customer, a bank, that is writing an operator that is just constantly checking to see namespaces. And if a namespace doesn't exist in its Open Unison database, it shoots up a red flag. Why is this here? Because it's that constant auditing. So now I'm logging into GitLab, and I'm logging in as my app owner / developer. Make the demo a little easier. I cut down on the amount of identities. So you see I got 4 projects here. I've got a build project. That's where my Tecton pipelines go. I got an operations project. I got 2 operations projects. I have one for dev and one for prod. That's where my YAML goes. And I have my actual application source code. Now I go to Argo, and I can see that I have projects and applications in Argo that line up to my projects in GitLab. So because I've got identity tying these things together, I only see in Argo what I can only see in GitLab that I can only see in OpenShift. And now I'm securely able to use these systems as one, even though they're completely different applications, like completely different people. I don't have multiple credentials. I don't have multiple requests. Everything is synchronized. So the first thing I'm going to do is try to remember what the first thing I'm going to do. So I'm checking out right now the build process. So we also stubbed out our Tecton pipelines and event listeners. So there's an event listener there. It's set up. It's integrated into GitLab. There's a token in there to protect it, to make sure that anybody who knows the URL can't just call it. That's been provisioned into the project inside of GitLab. So now I'm in the Argo production one. You'll see there's nothing there because, well, there's nothing there. So now we're going to actually start loading things up. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into operations, and I'm going to fork it. I think I'm going to fork it. Am I going to fork this one? Maybe not. The really cool thing here is that there are 2 operations projects. The dev operations project is a fork of the production operations project. So when it comes time to actually deploy to production, I'm running a merge request. So I just actually forked the application code project. So I can actually just check in the application code. That's the least amazing part of all this. So I'm going ahead, I'm cloning my project. I don't know, have there been any questions coming in, Chris?
Not that I haven't been able to answer.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
This demo was originally actually to show off how Tecton works. So there's a little more downtime than I would have liked. So I've pushed the code. Hello world, not really super amazing. There's the code, right? So the next question is, how do we get that code into a container and into production? So next, I'm actually going to go to my operations. So this is where I'm going to store my YAML. This is where my deployment file is going to go. So I'm going to go ahead now in the real world. What you would want is, as a developer, I would fork this repository into my own space, do my work, deploy it into my little dev environment, my little slice of the world, make sure I'm happy with it, and then do a merge request. But to make this demo a little simpler, we went ahead and just did it as the app owner. So I'm going ahead, and at this point, I'm checking in my YAML file.
I do have to say, all that identity was built quicker than anybody could whiteboard it.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the beauty of API driven, right? It's there.
Yeah, and it looks nicer.
Yeah. So you can see Argo just picked it up, and we have a broken deployment because we're not pointing to any specific tag. So how do we do this, right? We want our deployment to point to a specific tag. So the next thing we need to do is we've deployed our code, we've deployed our YAML. Now we need a container, right? So I'm going to go into build, clone it. And again, just like before, I would want to fork this, get it working in my environment, and do a merge request. But that gets even messier than this demo already is. And so I'm going to go ahead and just check out this code and add my pipeline into it. This part of building, so we did this was all based out of the last chapter of the book. I have to say, this was some of the most fun I had was figuring out how Tecton worked. And just trying to work through the different abstractions and, kind of how they approach things, because it's so different from, your typical kind of shell script based pipeline system. So I'm updating here, some parameters, making sure that's pointing to the right Git repo. If I had done this really correctly, you might say, well, you shouldn't have to do that at all. It should be generic, and you'd probably be right. So we pushed it in, and now follow the bouncing ball. You look at Argo here in the bottom right-hand corner, and you're going to find that it's going to pop up here with all of our additional pipeline objects. So we now have a pipeline that we can run. And because we automatically provisioned all of the event listeners and integrated it with all the repos, we don't have to manually execute a pipeline run. Like, we don't have to create a pipeline run object. We can now go over to Git. Now let's do a merge request. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to, this is kind of showing you there's nothing up my sleeve because there are no pipeline builds. And I'm going to go in and do a merge request. If this were GitHub world, we'd be doing a pull request, right? So I create my merge request and I'm going from my local project into the dev project, give the reasons, all that good stuff. So this is the community edition, so approvals are optional. Excuse me, but I merged it, and now you can see immediately stuff starting to happen in the Argo screen because the webhooks were all automatically integrated. So we now have a pipeline that's running. So our pipeline is really straightforward. It generates a tag based on a timestamp. It creates a build, pushes that build into my registry, and then updates my dev operations repo with a tag. So I'm actually going to kind of skip ahead here because the build process isn't really all that interesting. And what we can see here is that in our dev operations, we have this commit. The commit includes the commit ID from our application repo. So now we have a chain of custody from our dev environment all the way back to our application development repo. So now when it comes time to move into production, all we have to do is synchronize, do a merge request. I'm going to fast forward again because the rest of this isn't, everybody who watched this knows what it's like to sit and watch a pod load up. So now we come over to production, we run our merge request, and because we've set up the permissions in such a way that all these things are linked, the only reason we've had to go into OpenShift at all is just to show what's going on behind the scenes, right? We haven't actually had to do a single kube control or OC command to make any of this work. So I merge it, and then Argo does its beautiful thing where it goes ahead, pulls it in, deploys everything. And so that's everything. I mean, that's the whole demo. So, you're seeing that beginning to end without actually having to do any of that manually. And at no part did the ops folks ever have to get involved.
See ops
Amazing.
folks smiling. We have about 5 minutes left. One of the things I wanted to ask you was, this is all about enterprise identity. How does this relate, or doesn't it relate to just sort of regular identity for B2C type consumer, like an Uber or me ordering Domino's, like that?
Yes. So, I mean, there's application identity. But when you're talking about, those B2C systems, they're super laser focused. Like everybody's focused on that one thing, right? It's the delivery of a service of some kind or good, right? A pizza, a ride or something. Whereas when you get into enterprises, it's all siloed. It's organizationally siloed, right? Because you can't manage more than 3 people, 4 people. What's the rule of thumb? So you have to have silos. Like as much as we say, no, let's go horizontal, everything's the same. No, you have to have silos. Everybody has different ways of managing things. Everybody has certain things that their paycheck is dependent on, right? Like if your paycheck is dependent on your application being up and running and your bonus is based on that, you can be really, really careful not to hurt that. And so it's becomes really important to be able to supply business process that works with that siloing. And that's a big part of what makes enterprise identity so much harder in a lot of ways than B2C identity.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome.
All right, well, we have a couple minutes left. Anything else you wanted to mention, Mark, on this subject?
Wrap
up?
I guess some shameless self-promotion. Follow me on Twitter at MLBIM, and the recording from the KubeCon session. That one was a lot of fun. Actually, we did a demo of Open Unison and Fairwind's RBAC Manager to be able to do team-based authorization. So instead of that one project being everything, we did so that you could have multiple namespaces all managed by a team without actually having to have an ops person creating namespaces for you. There's some other projects that are getting really interesting. Hierarchical namespace is one that I'm really interested in seeing. That's going to go a long way towards making multi-tenancy a lot easier to manage. The Loft virtual clusters I just saw. That's another project I'm going to be keeping an eye on. That one looks really interesting. But yeah, this is an interesting space. This is a space where I think that there's still a long ways to go, and there's going to be a lot of fun getting there.
Yeah. Did I hear right? Your initials are MLB?
Mm-hmm.
No wonder you're a baseball fan.
Exactly.
I didn't know.
Exactly.
Yeah, in case anybody was wondering, the boxing accent, he's actually a Yankees fan.
Oh, diehard Yankees fan. Yep.
Yeah, which is a rare combination.
It comes from good parenting.
Yeah. Cool. Well, hey, I don't have anything else. Guess we can go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank you, Mark, for participating in this month's OpenShift TV security.
Thanks for having me.
On identity. Our pleasure. And I guess I'll hand it back to Chris. Any last parting words from you, or we can just
please stay tuned for the upcoming GitOps Guide to the Galaxy with Christian Hernandez and myself. I think we have a guest today. I forget, but we're gonna be there in just a moment. So stay tuned, folks.
Awesome.
And NL Hackham says, thanks for a wonderful show /demo.
Cool.
That's good. Glad you all liked it.
Thank you very much, Mark and Dave.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Take it easy. Stay safe out there.